Okay, let's talk a little bit about when the counselor and the client values collide. This really comes down to value exposure and value imposition, two very different things. Let's start with the idea that truly a counselor does not walk in the room value neutral. We walk in with our own set of beliefs, values, assumptions, our own cultural experiences, and even what we really think healthy looks like. But here's the thing, ethical practice does not require you to eliminate all of your values. That's virtually impossible. It's the way that we live our lives and how we govern what we do, our actions, and how we move forward, right? But ethical practice does require us to have enough self-awareness and recognize when those values begin to really influence how we're either conceptualizing the client or how we're walking through treatment. A really useful way of distinguishing between these two things is that having values, it's human. That makes you completely human. But when we use those values over the client's own autonomy, that's an ethical concern. So let's look at the difference between value exposure and value imposition. These are two very different things, right? So value exposure is when the client becomes kind of aware of something that you have as a perspective or a value. And this can be intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes it happens through self-disclosure or when we have a reaction to something, sometimes even the questions that we ask, right? And it could be where we choose to explore in the session. I'll give you a really good example of this one. When a client tells you, and I'm pregnant, what's your reaction? If you were in a social situation, would you go, oh my gosh, congratulations? Do you do that with a client as well? Do you allow the client in that moment to identify their feelings around it first before you react? Well, let's say unintentionally, your response was, oh my gosh, that's great, congratulations, right? But the client then sits there and says, it's not great. This is actually a scary thing for me. I'm scared about what I'm going to do and how I'm going to handle it. I haven't even told anybody yet. So here we are, in some ways, exposing our own belief that we value and think that children are great and wonderful, and this is a great celebration, while the client is feeling scared and worried, right? So this sometimes is unintentional that we even expose our own values. Now, let's look at value imposition. That's when we're using the therapeutic relationship and we're using it to move the client. Hear that? We're moving the client towards the counselor's preferred beliefs or decisions, behaviors, worldview. So we can distinguish this between two different questions, right? Did the client learn what I think? Well, that's probably an exposure. Or did I actually steer the client towards what I think they should do, right? I think anytime we use those words should, you should, that's when we get into tricky places. So imposition sometimes is very subtle. And I want you to imagine first, there are obvious examples, right? If we're trying to convince the client that they need to adopt a certain political view or adopt a certain religion, right? But there are some ethical problems that are very quiet, and we might not see those as easily. For example, if you have strong values about marriage and you repeatedly explore how, hey, I think we should discuss reconciliation, and really the client is there to discuss divorce. What if the counselor really values independence, right? You should be more independent. And all of this close family involvement, they are constantly in your decisions and they're constantly telling you which direction. I think that's very unhealthy, right? So you can hear these are very subtle. They're not as easy to find. What if a counselor believes in forgiveness And that's the key to healing. It's super important. And they continue to encourage a trauma survivor to move towards forgiveness of the person who perpetrated the trauma, and they're not really ready for that yet. Think about a counselor that really values higher education and thinks college is the best way for a young adult to really go. But maybe the client doesn't really want to do that. They're looking more at a trade. Last, think about a counselor's cultural worldview, right? What if your culture values direct communication and you start to label the client's indirect communication as avoidance? So none of these really require the counselor to say, you should believe what I believe, right? That would be super obvious that we're having that imposition. Sometimes even our language, it really disguises our values. This is one of the reasons that I strongly encourage that when you get to the point in practice where you are recording your sessions and sharing them with your supervisor, this is a fantastic opportunity for you to listen to the language that you use. Where do you notice that you use the words like healthy, unhealthy, appropriate, dysfunctional, resistance, even progress, right? All of these are value judgments, right? And they sound like, they're objective clinical conclusions, but we really have to ask ourselves, who decided what better looks like for the client? Did you decide it or did your client? That's how we really take that ethical practice to the next level. Sometimes there's really strong, clinical evidence behind our recommendations, but other times it's our preference that has quietly put on that clinical clothing. And we need to listen between the two. Ethical counseling doesn't require you to stop having values. So I want to make that very clear. But it does require you to become skilled enough to really know when your values are beginning to take up space that actually belongs to the client.